Hello and welcome to the Beyond Binary podcast. And today on the Beyond Binary podcast, we are honored to welcome Professor Kevin Lee, the Intel Social Justice and Racial Equity Professor of Law at North Carolina Central University School of Law. And Professor Kevin is a pioneering voice at the intersection of AI ethics, democracy, and human rights, dedicated to shaping the next generation of ethical tech leaders. Now, a visionary institution builder, he has founded major initiatives such as Campbell Innovation Institute and the Institute on AI and Democratic Governance, creating powerful bridges between academic research and real world impact. And Professor Kevin also teaches groundbreaking courses such as AI ethics, policy and law, AI ethics, and Black intellectual traditions, equipping professionals to solve the most complex challenges of our AI future. And his upcoming book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, Reclaiming Democracy in the Age of AI, offers practical pathways for rebuilding civic life in a rapidly changing digital world. Thank you, Professor Kevin, and it's such an honor to have you on the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to talk to you and your audience.
Thank you, Professor. So, Professor Kevin, you are a scholar of Alasdair MacIntyre. Tell me if I.
McIntyre, yeah. Alasdair MacIntyre, yes.
Okay, MacIntyre. Okay, so who talks deeply about virtues and practices. So, I'm curious, do you see a connection between this philosophical idea of virtue and the way we build AI systems today? And can we ever teach AI what virtue means, or is virtue something that only humans with our biological and emotional depth can truly understand?
Right. That's a great question, and I appreciate it. Let me begin by just mentioning that Shannon Valor from the University of Edinburgh wrote a wonderful book on virtue and technology, and she mentions MacIntyre. MacIntyre was a very important philosopher. He passed away last spring, actually. So he was very important in, say, the 90s and the early 2000s in recovering the idea of virtue as a foundation for ethical reasoning. And the difference between there are different types of ethical reasoning. One is, virtue ethics, which has an ancient tradition that goes back at least to Aristotle and Plato in the West. And the other is sort of a rights-based, or what they call deontological ethics, an ethics based on rules and rights and obligations. That finds its probably most sophisticated expression, or early sophisticated expression, with Immanuel Kant. And then various forms of utilitarianism, which I usually associate with John Stuart Mill. And so virtue, though, is different in that it's about living a life that's morally praiseworthy. And so the question is, how does the goal of living a moral life that's praiseworthy, how is that being touched by technology? How is technology challenging that goal? And then what does that mean for attempts to align AI ethics with human ethics, right? And what MacIntyre talks about communities of having moral practice and that our understanding of what's good and bad really are formed within communities where practices are developed that have their own ways of knowing what's right. So this is an interesting idea that, like I say, goes all the way back to at least Aristotle. Um, the way I see and what Professor Valor was really good at doing is showing how technology does is relevant to that. It's not neutral on that, right? That every technology in its own way puts forward a vision of what is a good life. And so we can assess the moral consequences of that by looking at the quality of the life that's being put forward. And I think that's sort of a simple way to do it. But I think it draws into lots of questions today. Uh, One of the things that, my students are always pointing out is how, I won't name names, but we were talking with a representative from one of the foundation model companies, and it was really an interesting conversation that occurred afterwards, after he had left. But the question was, if you think about all of the plurality of different ethical systems in the world, different moral practices in different communities,
Right.
uh, when you're building the ethical system for a large language model, which one do you use, or how do you apportion among the different ones? How do you address the plurality issue? I think this is a real problem with the foundation models, is that they're constantly in a tug of war between the need for coherence and the need to respect plurality. And the way that the question was posed to my students was, imagine you had a certain number of tokens and you could give it out to each one of the different ethical traditions that concern you. How would you do that? And after some discussion, I think that the best response was, you have to begin by realizing what an enormously privileged position it is to be in, to weigh the value of other people's moral traditions against each other, right? And I think this is a fundamental problem that lies at the heart of the enterprise of trying to think about virtue. And MacIntyre would have agreed with that. And I think he would have been concerned with the sort of narrowness of the goals that are being set. We talk a great deal about, and especially in the US, about innovation at all costs, it seems sometimes. But what kind of life, what kind of moral practices are we developing by seeking innovation endlessly? And are they the kinds of moral practice that that enable people to lead a decent life, a decent moral life, right? So that kind of thing. That's I think what McIntyre would want to say. So yeah, I definitely anyone who really finds that interesting, though, I would definitely recommend Professor Valler's book, uh, which I mean, I like that book a great deal, and I refer to it, and she does I think a makes a very good effort to try and be very inclusive in the book and
Yeah.
give some guidance on that issue.
Amazing. I'm definitely going to read this book. Thank you for referring Professor Kevin. And yeah. And also, Professor Kevin, in law, we treat corporations as legal persons. And now we are debating whether AI could also be considered a legal person. So, from a complexity point of view, are these entities real in any meaningful sense, or are we creating legal fictions that actually distract us from holding real humans responsible?
Yeah, that's a great question. I teach corporate law, and yeah, the fiction of, there's different ways to look at that question. One is, why does the law want to treat a corporation as a person? And there are reasons for legal personhood are often they're often justified through economic analysis. And the question is, even are those economic principles, which were developed during the early 20th century, um, when the Industrial Revolution was mechanical, right? And there's really good question, I think, about whether and to what extent we need to rethink the nature of the corporation itself in for the information age, and instead of looking at it as a almost like a machine, like a watch, that's running with mechanical parts. We need to see corporations as information systems, and they are. very different, I think, when we look that way. And it has deep bearings on not only how we what rights and obligations we want to give to a corporation, thus, personhood, but also the obligations of corporate boards in managing the corporation. So, and you mentioned, I study complex systems, and I think one of the problems is our early, it's an interesting time actually, our early 20th century notions of the corporation are not viewing it as a complex organic system that's growing and changing. It's like I say, it's much more like a watch than say a house plant, right?
Right.
But but more contemporary complexity economics is going to look at it as a house plant where the behaviors are often emergent from the actions of millions of people, or a large number of people interacting in very simple ways, but the creating patterns for the whole that are quite different. It's an interesting time in the U.S. at least. I see that kind of analysis as having a place, but you don't see it in the mainstream. It's sort of on the sideline, but the mainstream has has been looking more and more towards centralizing authority, just the opposite of what complexity would want, right? More centralized authority, more control, more top-down control,
Right.
whereas complexity would be more bottom-up and decentralized. So you might say that in the ever ongoing debate between John Maynard Keynes and Frederick Hayek, that Keynes is winning, and then we're having more and more centralization, except in crypto. Crypto is just the opposite. Crypto is all about decentralization.
Right.
So, but to get back to your question, like, what does that say about corporate personhood? And I think that, what we really need to do then is to think about what rights do we want the corporation to have, realize that personhood is a fiction, so we can shape it whatever way we want. It's not an ontological claim that this is a person. It is a fiction that allows us to achieve certain social goals. And then the question becomes, you know, do we want to repackage the corporation in an information age where we can see that entity as not maybe a person, but some sort of information entity, like an inforg, like that is different from a human person, but has some uh, integrity too. And then what rights do we want to give to it? And I think that's a much more fruitful approach than to try and use a blunt instrument like a concept of personhood to apply to that. We have to think like, what are we trying to do, and how do we achieve the goals? And also in a time when we're finding that corporate boards are increasingly using artificial intelligence systems to make decisions, and my guess would be in the very near future, increasingly using agental AI to operate the company. So these are like everything's in change, and all of that, it seems to me, challenges the sort of neoclassical economic tradition on which corporate governance is founded. Right? I know that's a long, kind of complicated way around to saying I don't know, but I don't know. This is the right answer. But it really is, I think, an area of research that needs to be and would warrant sustained attention.
Amazing. Thank you, Professor Kevin. And you also often write about complexity, science, and adaptive systems. So, if
Yes.
AI is massive, interconnected system rather than a single actor, does that mean the Western legal model focuses on individual liability and simply doesn't fit anymore?
Yeah, I think that's right. Because just everything I just said about the corporation could also be applied to thinking about, say, tort liability. Also, founded basically on, or it wasn't founded on it, but over the last, what, 40 years or so, the the economic analysis of law has given us sort of neoclassical economic formulas for thinking about tort liability. And there's a good question about whether those are still relevant. How would a more complex systems approach want to deal with that? I think those are very good questions to be asking. Um, there's a bigger question that may lie behind that too, and it goes to how we conceive of I teach jurisprudence or legal philosophy, and one of the questions that often motivates me in doing my research is to think about how the conception of law itself is evolving, right? That we can no longer, I think, so much of Anglophone law is based in from the mid 20th century on in conceptual analysis. And yet so much that we learn today about how meaning is formed really suggests that a good deal of the lived experience of human meaning is extra linguistic. Like we know things are true without needing or without even being necessarily able to assign words to the truth that we're trying to articulate. Um, and that's a real problem that needs to be addressed in the way we think about how law works. I'm working on a piece now on constitutional analysis and constitutional theory. And when you think about, our what 40, 50-year tradition in the West of or original intent, we have to realize that our ability to know that is somewhat limited by the fact that all we have is the language, right? And yes, that's a great resource, uh, but the actual intent may be somewhat less certain than what we can generate through just looking at the text. And I think, we can see that in a way often. Um, the way poetry works, for example. There's a philosopher named Charles Taylor who draws a distinction between what he says language as designative, where a word has a particular concept, there's a correspondence, or the use of language being generative, where the meaning actually emerges from the use of the language and the juxtaposition of concepts. And often, there's I think there's a Zen Buddhist phrase that you hear about like language is a finger pointing to the moon, and you don't want to confuse the finger for the moon,
Okay.
right? And this is, I think, something that actually the way large language models work actually suggests that that's a limitation on them. There's some wonderful work being done. I like to talk about books, but by David Gunkel, who's written quite a bit on this, and he makes the analysis of using Jacques Derrida's work, which talks about the disappearance of the author and the end of logocentrism. And he says, large language models are the sort of the ideal of that, right? They demonstrate the disappearance of the author. They have expression without authorial intent. But what does that mean, when you're thinking about what a law is, that language can have its meaning without any intent behind it? And how do we want to account for that in our society? So another long way around to say I really, I don't know. That's a good question. Good research
Okay.
question.
Thank you, Professor Kevin, for your insight. And also, you have studied the history of right-wing extremism. And do you think AI algorithms today are intentionally amplifying anger, division, or radicalization because outrage is profitable? And as a legal scholar, how do we even begin to regulate harms that are emotional social and cultural when the law traditionally only recognizes material damages?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, this is an interesting question. The law recognizes material damages, yes. Of course, we also include psychological damage. It's one of the great innovations in the 20th century, right? And privacy law, at the beginning of the 20th century or the end of the 19th, to maintain an action in privacy law, you had to show actual damage for a breach of privacy. And it's only, it's just, I think the last state in the US that recognized the new principle just happened in the last, 5 or 6 years. But the idea that intention, in the infliction of emotional distress can sustain, an action. I would imagine something similar would happen with AI. But the problem is that the regime that we have, it's evolving so quickly, the technology is evolving so quickly that we don't really have a good um, response in the legal system. And I think, yeah, we definitely see how in the recent past social media has benefited. And if Shoshana Zuboff's book called Surveillance Capitalism documents this, right? That social media um, really creates, I think, two things. One is uh, the the commercial value of rage. Right. That may be the product that's actually being put out as rage, because it gets people to act and to click on links and to follow stories. And that's good for marketing. Um, and that's been documented. That's what she documents. In my book, on democracy, so that's one, I mean, and I think it fits right with your analysis, right? That leads to um, the ability not only to sort of generate an angry populace, which we and division, but also the ability to target ads, which is what Cambridge Analytica was doing back in 2016. Targeting individuals and shaping their political views. That's definitely a challenge. The other challenge may be even more pernicious, and it's one that people don't talk about. And I think that has to do with the more subtle shift that's occurring in the way we view each other. And this to go back to MacIntyre, if you think of democracy as a virtuous practice, that democracy itself is putting forward a virtuous form of life, a virtuous way of living.
Right.
And one of the key components to that is to look at our other fellow citizens as human beings worthy of dignity, right? So I think there's two aspects. We have the rage aspect that says maybe we can get people angry enough that they stop looking at each other as
Right.
having dignity. But there's also the sort of deeper, I would call it an ontological claim, a claim about the nature of the person that we see seeing each other as these infinitely complex and beautiful creatures and start seeing each other as data sets, as risk assessments, rather than creatures worthy of human dignity, right? And that I think is deeply damaging to democracy. Martha Nussbaum wrote a book called Political Emotions, in which she argues that she calls it civic love, that we need to learn to um, have enough, care for our neighbors that even when we disagree with them, we know we're going to see them tomorrow. We know we're fellow travelers, and that eventually we will need each other. And I think
Right.
that losing that would be to lose the possibility of recovering democracy. And I worry about that. I wonder if one of the sort of famous incidents in America involved African American woman who was sleeping in her apartment, and she had been misidentified as being involved. I think it was in a drug ring. But at any rate, the police bust through the door, and her boyfriend had a gun, and he, have a bunch of people running into your apartment. He pulled out his gun, and they shot him, and they shot her like 12 times, or I forget, but she died in the hallway, and she'd never really got a chance to speak. She was never treated as a person. She was just a threat assessment that had been made through a bureaucratic process. And in the end, no one was accountable because the system had failed, not any particular person, right? And I worry about creating systems, computational systems, where a system failure results in a person being denied their identity as a human being. And whether that results in a death or just um, being denied basic human rights, it's appalling. And we need to find ways to resist that. Sorry.
Absolutely. And also, there's so much of, active misinformation and disinformation, and we really don't know what is right and what is wrong, and there's also sort of liar's dividend. So yeah, I think all that's very concerning with the social media as well. Yeah. And also, Professor Kevin, much of today's AI regulation is shaped by Western and rule-based legal thought. And from your constitutional theory work, do you think Western law is capable of integrating non-Western ethical frameworks such as Ubuntu, Confucian, Confucianism, or Buddhism, or is the system too rigid to evolve?
Yeah, yeah, and this goes back to what I had said earlier about the sort of fundamental tension between, a need for coherence and a need to respect pluralism. And my question there would be, uh, in our geopolitical awareness, how much are we willing to yield coherence, which is, being determined by Western values to that global respect for pluralism. And I, have to say, I think it's possible to build a better system, but at least with the current direction that US AI policy is heading, I don't think it's likely. I think that where we are, I mean, we're painting a global competition among countries where innovation is the goal, and this desire to win, whatever that actually would mean, the AI race, as though it was an arms race, doesn't lend itself to respecting pluralism and slowing down and building a more inclusive system. I don't see that changing much, and I worry about the future of that because there's nothing particularly, even within the U.S., right? We have this debate going on right now, uh, in the debate between those who argue for uniform federal regulation versus state regulation. And right now, I think the dominant, the thumb is on the scale of the federal side, and the states are struggling. I would favor, yeah, it's interesting too. I would favor a more state experimentation with regulation because in the law, if I were the general counsel for a corporation, I would prefer to have a strong, you know, statement from, I don't know, Colorado or California on what AI liability is going to be, rather than to have the feds say, the federal government say, well, we're working on something. Because there's so much uncertainty. It's better to have the certainty that you can respond to than uncertainty that may be dependent. Like right now, there is no federal regulation. There's a few bills. I would say our Congress and Senate are not really very active in passing any legislation at all, and certainly not in this kind of controversial area. And what we have is an executive order, which could change anytime there's a regime change in the executive, right? It's again the executive order. So there's so much instability at the federal level. The states are actually more concrete. I think we need something like that, where if we went around the world and let different countries speak about what they thought needed to be done in regulation, we could maybe find what maybe not, we wouldn't maybe agree with all of it, but we would find certain standards, ones that we know we can rely on and that will be stable, and that would respect more cultural pluralism. I think that could actually be a benefit, but I just don't see, I think it's going to be a long road before we can get there. And I worry about what's going to happen on that road before we do, right? But yeah, I think it's one of the most important problems that we're facing right now.
Right. Thank you, Professor Kevin, and also your research on philosophy of information. And today we are drowning in information, but starving for wisdom. So, how should law evolve to prioritize truth and information quality over the speed and volume that tech companies optimize for?
Yeah, I think that's another great question, and I do spend a good deal of time thinking about um, the nature of law from an informational standpoint, and I have to say it's been an interesting journey. It's led me to think about complex systems. I think we need to be much more sensitive to the another philosopher, Bruno Latour, talked about the need to recognize the agency of the network itself. That, most of our political theory talks about the government and individuals, and there's not a good account of the way the network itself has its own demands on the political system, the very fact that it exists. And I think that that will grow over time. I mean, I think we're seeing that in really interesting ways. So yeah, we need to broaden our perspective on law. I it's we need to think about what does it mean today to have the rule of law. Most of our thinking about that reflects, again, 17th century notions of the sovereign and checking the will of the sovereign. Today, I think we need to refocus it on information and the who has the information and how they can use the information.
Right.
I think that's a very fundamental shift in how our political theory works and in how our conception of the rule of law. We need to find ways, and this is one thing I've been thinking about. So I'll throw it out here, and if people want to reply, that'd be great. But I think we have to have a right to have a public face that's and that protects our private life. So I should be able to put out, this is who I want to be known as.
Right.
And there should be a right to be able to maintain that doesn't go down into thinking about, what I do that I may not even be aware of, right? I think that's really essential to maintaining human dignity. I haven't quite worked that out yet, but I think absent that, it'll be really hard to maintain any kind of perspective on human dignity and human and freedom, right? That we need to be able to claim a right that, you're prying too far, government or private enterprise shouldn't be allowed to pry too deeply into who I am beyond my public face.
Right.
Otherwise, we need that private space to form our thoughts and to be, to have the kind of um, reasoning and maybe that kind of affectivity that's necessary for democracy.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Thank you, Professor Kevin. And finally, so now we see a polarized debate, for example, total deregulation versus banning AI altogether. So, is there a middle way, a complexity informed policy approach that allows innovation while meaningfully protecting society?
Well, I don't think there's a comprehensive principle, right? But I do think there are prudential steps. And Stuart Russell has been advocating with his group for a pause on searching for superintelligence. And they have a statement, and I signed on that. I think that we need to slow down, and it runs against the drama of this supposed geopolitical crisis to slow down. But what we end up with is the prisoner's dilemma, that if we're rushing, then everyone else has to, and if everyone else is, then we have to. And but if we could somehow through international cooperation, agree to just pause and let the smart people like you who do AI ethics catch up with all of the events that are happening at such a breakneck speed in technology. I think we need that. I really do. And it's not unprecedented. Um, and in fact, maybe relatedly, one of the areas where we have seen human attempts to just stop the research is in genetic engineering, right? Where we know that there's a lot of potential danger there, and the scientific community has agreed to just slow down, and there's certain things we're not going to do, and so on. We may need something like that. I worry about where we're heading right now too, in that sort of synthesis of particularly genetic engineering and artificial intelligence, which could greatly accelerate what's happening, and sort of put an end to maybe that reticence to investigate some areas. And I strongly believe that in the next 10 years, if not sooner, we'll see meaningful breakthroughs in quantum computing, which is going to, again, just greatly accelerate everything. So I think finding the political will and wisdom in slowing down, even when we could go faster, and putting safeguards around, and like I say, particularly the biotech, I worry about democratizing the ability to create new biological entities. That doesn't sound like it ends well. I don't want the 14-year-old high school student deciding to create a virus that who knows where it would go, right? Those, like, we need safeguards around these things. So
Right.
yeah, but pausing is the key. And so yeah, I would encourage everyone to, this is the thing, right? In this age where there's so much centralization and sort of top-down governance, and most people feel they can't do anything, you can find, those opportunities to sign on to statements that say slow down, like Dr. Russell's, and governments do listen to those. They at the end, they're only stable as long as there's sufficient political endorsement of what they're doing. So I think people who are concerned about these things really need to take action at the individual level.
Right.
So yeah.
Thank you so much, Professor Kevin, for this insightful discussion. And it has been an absolute honor to, learn so much from you. And I'm sure the audience has also gained a lot of insight from our discussion. And we're, eagerly waiting for your upcoming book, The Better Angels of Our Nature and Reclaiming Democracy in the Age of AI. Thank you so much, Professor Kevin, and for
Thank you so much for inviting me to come and talk with you and your audience. I truly appreciate it.
thank you, Professor Kevin. Thanks a lot.
And
Bye bye.
take care.